The Platform for Collaboration on Tax is holding its first global conference at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The conference, which started on Wednesday, February 14, focuses on the key directions for tax policy and administration needed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, our next conversation is on the role of tax in supporting sustainable economic growth in Nigeria. And I'm being joined by the Director, Sustainable Business Initiative, University of Edinburgh, Professor Kenneth Amaeshi. Good morning, Professor Amaeshi. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Good morning.
So you tell me, what's the correlation between taxation and the UN Sustainable Development Goal?
The UN Sustainable Development Goals, we need resources to be funded. So taxation is one of the means through which those goals will be supported. So taxation is about raising money for the government and also for government to deploy the resources, money in this instance, to support some of the sustainable development goals.
Now looking at Nigeria, coming back to Nigeria, where are we in achieving this sustainable development goal?
The Sustainable Development Goals, as you would remember, replaced the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals ran up to year 2000, and Nigeria didn't do much in that regard. China, for example, lifted about 500 million people out of poverty. So the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to support. It's kind of the new initiative that replaced the Millennium Development Goals with an agenda that it has about 17 goals, which are expected to be met by 2030. So it's still the very early stages, and Nigeria has keyed in very well. The present regime has been doing a lot and talking about it. And as you imagine, there are some initiatives out there. The former Minister of Environment did a very good job before she went back to the United Nations. So it's early stages, I will reckon. But the Nigerian community or government is keen into appropriately.
Nigeria has been on a kind of a tax drive in order to generate, revenue. How effective do you think they have been able to mobilize their domestic resources? Because without effective domestic resources, I believe that you wouldn't achieve much in terms of sustainable development.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, taxation is very critical to the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Nigerian government has been trying. I mean, one of the clear examples would be what Lagos has done with internally generated revenues. And it seems that Lagos' agenda or the Lagos success, to a large extent, is being mainstreamed. So in the whole, I wouldn't say we are doing fantastically well, but it's a journey and it started, and I suspect it will continue to grow. So Lagos is a clear example. Some other states are kind of trying to learn from what Lagos did. But there are also many other questions to be asked. So it's not about also the revenue generated, but also how the revenue is used.
When you talk about questions to be asked, there are any concerns in terms of perhaps the way the federal government is going about getting these taxes?
One of the problems of taxation in Nigeria, and it's also a vexing problem, is the issue of institutional trust. Most of the time, if you talk to Nigerians, it's not that we don't like paying our taxes. It's not like we like to be chased around to do the right thing. But there is a fundamental problem, which is in terms of how our taxes are used. So in the Nigerian context, it's difficult to have people talking about taxpayers' money. So it's a discourse that is often missing in our context. So whereas in some other climes, taxation or taxpayers' money is very much used as a way to also hold governments accountable. So in a country like ours, where our revenue over the years have largely come through natural resources, the incentive to rely on taxation has been quite limited. The more probably we do, maybe focusing on corporate tax or petroleum tax, as that case may be. But the point there is that there is what I may call a fundamental dislink between people as citizens and the government. So that in itself creates a problem for taxation. So how much do people trust that the money collected through tax will be used appropriately if the large amounts received through other resources are not properly utilized? So what guarantees anyone that tax money will be used appropriately. And that, for me, is a fundamental problem in the drive for more tax in Nigeria.
Do you think Nigeria has got a very good tax structure, and perhaps the issue becomes implementation, or we have a reason to change our tax structure?
I mean, that's a very good question. And sometimes people talk about restructuring. The restructuring also has to do with the way taxation is organized in Nigeria. So, for example, we have the FAC, okay, the federal account, where most of the taxes from the regions of Nigeria go to the center, and people have issues in terms of how that money is redistributed. So some states have more local government than the others, and this money is passed through the local government, through the state. So even though in the organization or governance of tax in Nigeria, there are some fundamental questions to be asked, and people are raising issues about equity, fairness, and to what extent people should be responsible for the resources generated in their zones, and the implication of that for taxation. So on the governance, on the structure of it, I think there is something to be done. But there is also the other side of it, which is in terms of what I said before about trust, and how trust in itself undermines the ability for people to believe in government, as well as in government in making sure the taxations go the extra mile they're meant to do.
That takes us to the issue of the social dimension of tax. Now, besides generating revenue for government, how can Nigeria structure its tax policy to perhaps help fight inequality, promote productivity, sustainability, and intergenerational, fairness that you mentioned?
I think one thing is to be sure that because people would respond to what they see. Okay, so if there is no evidence to suggest that our tax money are being used in a good way, the incentives for people to pay more tax will be very much reduced. So when you talk about the social elements, the social dimensions, in some countries, some of these social projects, social programs are funded by taxpayers' money. And taxpayers' money will come to when people are willing to pay. So in the Scandinavian countries, for example, they may pay as much as 40% in terms of income tax. In some countries also, depending on your income rate, you will also pay more tax. But in Nigeria, I think we are about 20–25%. But even at that, people struggle to pay that 25%. And they devise all sorts of ways to avoid tax. So as you would imagine, tax avoidance is not a crime. Other tax evasion is. So what organizations do and individuals, they find very creative lawyers, very creative accountants that will help them structure their tax in such a way that they pay the minimum. But what we don't necessarily often think about is that the less we pay, the more we make it difficult for the government to meet its social needs. So the government now will need to depend a lot more on revenues coming from natural resources. But as much as we have that, it further pushes people away from their democratic responsibilities and their citizenship roles. So it's having that understanding that there is about cause and effect. If we don't pay our taxes as much as we want to, or as much as would be necessary, then we'll not be able to meet our social needs. But at the same time, people need to be convinced that whatever they pay will be used for those social purposes. So there is a link between social development and taxation, but that link needs to be very clear, and people need to be convinced that whatever they pay will be used for the social development programs.
Where do you think Nigeria is when you compare them with their peers, perhaps in other African countries, in terms of paying taxes? Do you think our taxes are higher than the others, or other countries pay higher taxes than we do?
I'm not that conversant with taxation in all the African countries, but there is a report I read recently by the United Nations and the IMF talking about the least developed economies and their taxation. And what they found that I think about 75% or 75% of those countries usually have less than 50% of their GDP coming from internally generated revenue, and that is a problem. So what you like to see is that most of these countries getting more of their internal revenues beyond or more than 15%. I think Nigeria at the moment is not up to that 15%, and it gives a good comparison compared to other, or what you may call least developed economies as well. But if we want to develop, and if we want to take sustainable development seriously, then there is need for us also to ensure that the internally generated revenues are beyond 15% of the overall GDP.
What would you have to say to the Federal Inland Revenue Service in this regard towards helping, call it some of these taxes?
The Inland Revenue has been using all sorts of strategies. I think there's the latest one called VADE, and if I get it right, which we are trying to encourage people by all means, by using pressures of different sorts, to ensure that people pay. But there's a fundamental question there, which is, why is it that people struggle to pay? And I don't think the government body in that regard, the FIRS, has been
Perhaps
able to
it's because of the economic
that.
condition in the country.
Yes, it's probably linked to that, but at the same time also it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of institutional trust. But what I would suggest is that the FIRS, for example, might want to spend more time advertising, showcasing some of the projects or initiatives that has been supported and paid for by taxpayers' money, in order to make it visible to people that the taxes they pay are informing and shaping the infrastructural development. It might be social programs in school and whatever it is. But the efforts of the FIRS in terms of how the money is spent needs to be much more visible. We can understand their drive in terms of getting more money in. But the other thing is also for the government body to be much more innovative in their approach. So instead of, if people are willing to keep their money and say, well, there is this tendency that people believe or think that they can spend their money better than the government because they rightly or wrongly think that they have now constituted their own local government, so where they provide their water, their electricity, and all sorts. So if they think they can manage their money better in terms of infrastructure development or social program, can the government create incentives for them so that people who engage in those things get some kind of tax relief? So you may find entrepreneurs who are interested in social impact, for example, or engaging in impact investment of some sort. Probably they may need to have taxation or tax incentives to encourage them to do more of those things, so that government takes a backseat in providing social infrastructure in the scale we want for sustainable development goals.
Right. So what role can the private sector and the NGOs play in promoting the taxation for sustainable development? Yeah,
the whole thing about sustainable development goals means also that they shouldn't be left for governments alone. So it brings to the question of governance. And in that regard, we're thinking about the private sector on one hand, we are looking at the NGOs on another hand, and government in general. So the private sector has a critical role to play through what they call corporate sustainability, which is the private sector engagement on the engagement to ensure that the sustainable development goals are met. So they have to move away from the traditional CSR, which is more of philanthropy, what businesses do for society, to think about how they can contribute to taxation, pay fair tax. The payment of fair tax has become one of the CSR agendas where companies are being seen to be responsible. The companies should also be less strategic in terms of how they engage with taxation, because they have the resources to employ the best hands that will enable them pay the minimum tax. So in that regard, companies themselves need to get more involved in the sustainable development goals by also paying their fair share of tax and avoiding all sorts of negative strategies that might have negative impacts on the tax revenue collected by government. On the other hand, the NGOs also need to have a voice in the conversation. So you will struggle, I suspect, to find an NGO in Nigeria that is focused solely on tax. I know one, which is Christian Aid, that is one of the campaigns they are launching now is on tax justice. So you want to see more NGOs having a voice in that conversation and also playing the governance role, so that the governance of taxation is not just left for government, but it's a collective responsibility from all facets of society.
Okay. Just before I let you go, I know that in January 2016, Nigeria joined 30 other countries to sign what they call tax cooperation. Now, what lessons do you think Nigeria would have to learn from other countries?
I think
just a quick one.
Yeah, one critical thing is accountability. If we are able to establish the link between the money collected and how it's used and how people can hold government accountable for how the resources are used, that will be, for me, one of the key lessons to be learned from other countries.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor, for coming on the show. I've been speaking with Professor Kenneth Amaeshi. He's the Director, Sustainable Business Initiative, University of Edinburgh.